Welcome, everyone, wherever you're calling in from. It's evening where I'm logging in. So grateful to share virtual space with you today, especially since this is our last DEI meetup for the year. So I'm really excited to be talking with Lisa today. And before we get started, just going to do some housekeeping, some intros, especially if you're new. If you're new, feel free to say hello. I'm new, so we can give you a warm welcome. For those of you who are new and this is your first time, yes, this is She Geeks Out, one of our virtual events that we hold quarterly to talk about DEI issues in the workplace, out of the workplace, and how we can continue to make our workplaces better. So, our mission is abolishing inequity in the workplace. And so, we do a lot of workshops for some of our clients. And then we also support our community members who are trying to figure out, well, how do I implement being myself or just DEI strategies in general. So if this is your first time, welcome. You are in an awesome space. And I'm not just saying that because I'm part of the SGO team. So as you can probably see, I'm the L&D manager at SGO. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I love that action is already happening in the chat. I'm a true facilitator, so I'm going to ask, please share who you are in the chat. You can share your name, a little bit about yourself, whatever you want to share, a career, passion project, whatever it is you want folks to know tonight. And then also where you're calling in from. I got to talk to someone who was calling in from another state. So it's always nice to mingle with people who are from different spaces. And so go ahead and share that in the chat if you haven't already. And as you all are doing that, I just want to make sure that we all know all the ways to work this magical platform. So you made it here, which means that for the most part, you knew how to get here. But just a quick note, when you first arrived, you probably noticed that there were some tables that you got to sit at. Those tables will be available after my fireside chat with Lisa. So feel free to go back to them. And then also, we'll try to make sure that we have at least 30 minutes to have a conversation, Lisa and I, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A. So what you'll see on your panel is your chat button, which you all are already showing some excitement in the chat. I love it. You'll also see something that says Q&A. So if you want to ask a question during my fireside chat with Lisa, feel free to put that there. And the cool thing about that option is if more people have the same question, you can upvote it. So it'll upvote and then I'll ask the question to Lisa as we close out. So those are the few main things I want you to know about. And before we officially get started, because we do this work as DEI practitioners or advocates, one of the most important things for me to do right now is a land acknowledgement. And if you aren't familiar with this, feel free to just take note or just witness my ability to acknowledge where I'm calling in from. And even though I'm calling in virtually, I'm physically somewhere, right? So the first thing I want to say is I want to acknowledge that SGO was originally founded on territory of the Massachusetts and Pawtucket tribe, right? And what this means is that I wouldn't be here if the folk before me weren't great stewards of the land. And so I want to recognize those folks, right? And their resilience in protecting this land. And hopefully we can aspire to uphold our responsibilities in wherever we might be calling from. Also acknowledging that a lot of havoc happened for SGO to be founded where it was founded, right? In terms of indigenous communities. And so, as much as we recognize the strength and the resilience, it's also important to recognize the stories that we don't always talk about. So, if you can just take a moment to join me in just being present in your body and recognizing where you might be physically and what that might mean for you right now. Thank you so much for joining me in that. If this is your first time learning about land acknowledgement, I just went ahead and dropped the link in the chat if you're interested to know where you're calling in from. And I see some folks already sharing the indigenous folk who lived and currently live on the land that they're at. So I'm calling in from the DC, Maryland area, and I'm specifically giving a shout out and recognition to the Piscataway people. All right, so let's see. We got folks all up in the chat, people from Texas, New Jersey, Love in North Carolina, Portland, Oregon, Boston, Brooklyn, Nashville. Oh my gosh, this is amazing. This is so amazing. Once upon a time, we only had people from the Boston, Pawtucket, Massachusetts land, and now we're all over the place. So, welcome, welcome. Feel free to share in the chat if you haven't already. And as you all are doing so, I'm going to go ahead and prep us for our amazing, wonderful speaker. Her name is Lisa Russell, and I'm going to say a little bit about Lisa before she joins me on the stage. So, Lisa Russell passionately tackles real world problems with innovative and impactful solutions. After several years in the financial service industries, Lisa gained extensive entrepreneurial experience holding key positions on the founding teams of tech startups. Over the years, she has been recognized for her commitment to community and the impact of her efforts focused on mentorship, education, and creating opportunities for women in marginalized communities. Currently, she leverages her passions and expertise to help take the guesswork out of diversity and inclusion as the co founder and CEO of Valeria. Lisa, please join me on the stage. I love when this happens, y'all. This is like drum roll.
So, hello everyone. Thank you so much.
Yes, you're getting all the love right now. I can see an applause, a celebration hat. We are glad you
Sometimes
made it.
technology is hard.
Yes, totally fine. So, Lisa, before we even jump into our fireside chat, how are you doing? How are you showing up today?
Oh, I'm doing great. I'm doing great. I'm showing up a little scattered, admittedly. I was just explaining to Fatima earlier that we, as a company, are starting an accelerator program. The announcement's actually official today. We'll be a part of what's called the Equitech Techstars program, which is all mission aligned, and you'll learn more about me and what that means here shortly. But it's so exciting, and so I am both just excited and thankful that I can have additional ways to move forward in this work.
Absolutely. And
Yeah,
congrats again to you and your team.
thank you.
Best of luck in terms of
Mm,
that process. And if folks aren't familiar with that, maybe we'll drop a link for them if you have something to share. Would
will do.
love. Awesome. Awesome. All right. So, Lisa, some folks might be new to you and the work you do at Alaria. So, can you give us a quick elevator pitch and why inclusion as a focus area?
Of course. So as you briefly heard a bit in my bio there, my name is Lisa. I am co-founder and CEO of Alaria, pronouns she, her. And we as an organization are an HR tech company that says that we're taking the guesswork out of diversity and inclusion. But what that means in our work is that we're really measuring inclusion and aiming to pinpoint where organizations, where business leaders can focus to really drive greater inclusion, greater diversity, greater employee satisfaction, and ultimately greater business performance. And so, if we're looking at why inclusion, that's such a great question. There's a really great quote that I like to reference, and we reference it often in our workshops. It's by the Neuro Leadership Institute, and it says, "Diversity without inclusion is a revolving door of talent." And it's this great, short but like very visual quote that really kind of encompasses the issues and some of the challenges that we're seeing in this work. We refer to it as the DEI disconnect. The fact that a lot of folks are out in the world and they're talking about DEI or DNI, IND, whatever the acronyms might be. There's so many these days. But the reality is that most of the studies, most of the initiatives are really focused on diversity metrics only and really just representation metrics. We're seeing folks set goals that are things like, let's move the needle 1% in terms of representation of women in the organization, or let's make sure that we're going to hire or recruit 2% more Black employees, or whatever it might be that they need to work on internally. But the reality is that that's not enough, and that's not creating those folks up for success within the organization, and it's not truly creating an inclusive and equitable work environment. And so we're focused on inclusion mostly because our research, our experiences show that by creating a more inclusive work environment, we are able to then benefit and truly attain greater diversity and greater employee satisfaction, which is a beautiful ripple effect across the organization and its potential for success.
Ah, love that. Yes, snaps to all of that. I already see the love you're getting from someone who says they subscribe to the Layer newsletter. I'm subscribed as well. So you all are always sharing some really insightful things around DEI work, but
Well,
also highlighting inclusion.
Thank you so much. We'll definitely plug the link to the newsletter here in the chat. I swear we don't go anywhere without somebody mentioning our newsletter, and it's such a point of pride for us. My co-founder and business partner Arshia Malik puts that together every single week. Can't take any credit for it, but we love to hear that you're enjoying it. So thank you.
Love it, love it. Thank you. And I see someone bringing in that metaphor that Verna Myers talks about when we talk about DEI, right? Like diversity is being invited to the dance, inclusion is being asked to dance. And I've seen that so many times, and people have definitely played with it, right? Some people talk about, being asked about what kind of music to be played or what kind of food and all these things. So keep going in the chat as we keep chatting, but a lot has happened, right? So you gave us this awesome pitch and I'm here for it. And it's like, okay, these past 18 months were wild, especially in the DEI world when we think about like what do we need to focus on? How do we do this work? How do we implement certain strategies intentionally? And so one of the things I would love for you to do before we dig into like the details is, can you just share some of the top 2 to 3? I know that's not enough, but the top 2 to 3 successful trends you're seeing within companies and why those trends are successful.
Okay. Um, yeah, we're going to start with the good stuff. What's working? That's always great. Uh, it's I would say the first one, right away is just a combination of what doesn't and does work. So bear with me, it is a do. But I think that we have to acknowledge that there isn't a silver bullet to this work, right? So what is working is that increasingly organizations are going beyond simple representation metrics and generic trainings, and they're starting to listen to their employees to understand where are the real opportunities, what do my employees need, how can I actually help them um, feel as if they are better supported in their work on a day-to-day basis, that they're included, that they have access to the things they need to be able to excel in their role. And so the first thing is definitely just this shift from out of the box, trainings and study based, like, improvement metrics and really generic processes that have time and time again over the last 40 plus years failed us, but rather saying, hey, let me just actually listen and see what folks are saying they need, and deliver on that. And it sounds simple, but it makes such a big difference in terms of creating that inclusive and equitable space. The second one would really be this, like, just the idea of like creating clear focus areas. The other thing about diversity, equity, and inclusion is that we have all these business leaders out in the world, particularly in 2020, that made these big promises, right, or these commitments to change. But the reality is they don't know how to do that. They're not experts in this work. And so they made these promises and now they're like, oh, what do we do now, right? And the reality is that they can't do everything. They're not going to be able to move the needle in all directions. This work encompasses things like recruiting, it encompasses things like retention, employee satisfaction, supplier diversity, the list goes on, in ways that you could focus and try to improve. And if you try to do them all at the same time, you're not going to move the needle, significantly in any direction. And so we find that it's most powerful. What is working is by saying, hey, after we've listened to our employees, let's really get clear on what are our goals for the next 6 months, year. And like, let's be super transparent about that. This year, we're going to look to move the needle by doing X, Y, and Z. These are our 3 goals. Here's how we're going to accomplish them. And by being super clear on where you're going to focus and how you're going to change as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusions, we're not all speaking the same language. We don't have expectations that are misaligned with the initiatives we're actually investing in. And I think that, by saying, hey, we're going to really focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion this year, nobody knows what to actually expect. So by being clear and saying, we're going to create mentorship programs and reverse mentorship programs so that everyone has access to understanding other folks' roles, and like being super clear, like, that's just an example, right? But by being clear, now folks have expectations that are in line with the work that you're doing. They can hold you accountable for that work. But ultimately, the great thing is that we can all work together, like, towards that goal. So now it's like you're unlocking everyone's day-to-day behaviors to head in that direction, because they're thinking, oh, right, we're working towards this, or like, oh, right, I need to like prioritize this because that is the goal of the organization. So clear areas of focus and like key like metrics of success for that, certainly is like my preference is like data, but And then the final one is just like increased transparency. We're seeing that, both internally across the organizations and externally, there's an increased interest and accountability around transparency. And by being clear on those goals, increasing transparency across the organization, we're now able to see that, hey, we can not only, move the needle, get everybody on board, hold people accountable, but we can make sure that we're all, aligned in this work. And I think that those three are the things that, are really going to change the way that we go about this work in organizations.
Yes, love all of that you listed, right? And for us, that since we do facilitate workshops, we definitely are seeing some of the same trends, right? Like, I love what you said around moving from out of box trainings. Like, it's not a one size fits all. Like, what might work for one company might not work for another. Obviously, you keep
Right.
the intentionality behind the DEI work, but it's also like, how are you even assessing to see what the company needs? I love the clear focus areas. What I heard also is like not just talking the talk, but also walk the walk, right? So, yes, people made a lot of promises, especially the last year, as we think about all that has happened from the death of George Floyd to anti Asian discrimination to border patrol to immigration. And I could keep going, right? And just thinking about how does that even connect in the workplace, or recognizing that sometimes our personal isn't separate from the professional. And then increased transparency is such an interesting point because we've had a lot of companies ask, like, what does that look like? What is that process? Who do I talk to? Do I say certain things to certain people? Do I not? And so, while all those things are working, I think on the flip side, what I'm interested in hearing is, what's not working. Can you talk a little bit about your research and the different ways people are feeling excluded in the workplace?
Absolutely. And one thing that just like popped in my head, if I may, just before answering that, is that point about transparency that you just made. This It's amazing how hard and uncomfortable transparency can be, and I completely acknowledge that it's terrifying to think, oh, we're going to admit areas of where we need improvement, and we're going to have people in a position to hold us accountable for that, right? And there are different ways that you can tackle that, and certainly a whole conversation for another time. But I will tell you, what's really sad is that we have in our work um, come across organizations that have data, like we'll collect some really powerful data for them, and then said, no, I don't want to know, or I can't have that report, because they're afraid of the risk of knowing that information or acknowledging that information. And so we are in this interesting time in the world where, we definitely are seeing organizations that are on both sides of that, where like some are truly embracing it and stepping into that discomfort and allowing their values to be prioritized over the risks that are involved, rather than really say, no, that's going to remain a closed book, no thank you. And so if you are in one of those latter or those later organizations, yeah, it's really hard to do this work. But to answer the actual new question, yeah, our research and like what we're seeing in terms of exclusion, let me take a step back, maybe to contextualize the type of information and type of research we conduct to help folks understand that question and its intention. So we measure inclusion, and we do that specifically in the workplace by collecting specific moments of exclusion that employees and different members in a community face. And so when we're hosting workshops or coming into organizations to measure inclusion with them on an ongoing basis, what we're provided is not only information around identity, representation, satisfaction, role, and some of that metric diversity type data, but we're attaching to that information around those specific moments that are causing folks to feel excluded, or barriers that they're facing that they feel like they're facing unfairly. And in their own words, they're describing those moments. And not only are they describing those moments, but they're letting us know who or what they feel is the source of exclusion in that moment. So, if you're saying, hey, I often get interrupted in meetings, which is a pretty common one we hear, we can say, okay, like who or what in that moment is causing you to feel excluded? It's like, oh, it's my direct manager all the time, or it's like my peers, or like, if we're talking about, I don't have access to like growth opportunities here, it's like, what's preventing you? Is it a policy? Is it a manager? Is it like the leadership team? And so we get to really understand what the barriers they believe they're facing are from their unique experiences. The other important piece of this is that we're categorizing those experiences of exclusion. the employees themselves get to just say, in this framework, so we have categories of inclusion framework, happy to send you all the information about how we think about that, how we organize, you're welcome to use it. But it's a framework of 9 categories of which we're thinking about common types of experiences, and not only common types of experiences, but like the initiatives that can empower those changes that we need in that category, right? And so it's a way to both organize data on our side, but also organize the way that we're thinking about moving forward. So an analogy is often helpful here, whereas when you go into the doctor's office and you're having to fill out all those forms that you're like, I swear I've given you this information 100 times. Why am I filling out this form again? But it's like you're checking off like the symptoms and various things that you're experiencing, and like, why are you here today? What are you feeling? Like, what are the things you've faced in the last year? Whatever it might be, right? And it's that long list of words that like half of them I can't pronounce, half of them I've never seen before, or whatever. Those symptoms end up being how they understand and come up with a diagnosis for you. So they're able to say, oh, this is what you're experiencing. Okay, here's what I think that, here's the diagnosis, and here's the custom treatment plan based on those symptoms, right? And so the experiences of exclusion for us are the symptoms. And so we're coming into organizations to say, based on these symptoms, here's what we think is happening. Here's your diagnosis. Here's what we think you should do going forward. Your treatment plan, if I will. Okay, so that was a lot of information, but just to say, that's kind of how we get data. And so over the last few years, we've been going into organizations and we've captured thousands of different experiences of exclusion. And they're from organizations that range from small tech startups all the way to like global Fortune 100 companies, across nonprofits and for-profits, across communities and government and regulatory bodies. And so we have a wide range of information that really gives us a sense of like what's happening today in the workplace, like what is causing people to feel excluded. So I would love to kind of just rattle off a couple of the things that we're seeing, if that makes sense. But any questions up to there? Yeah.
Not at all, and we love a good, chat engagement. So if folks are like already know the first one, or like I can tell you like what I've seen, please feel free to add your own moments of exclusion or what you are seeing in the workplace. And I see someone saying they love your framework. I do too, right? Like
Thank you.
as we think about the ways people are excluded. But yes, please go ahead and share.
Yeah. So it may not surprise you that, 2020 and 2021 have been interesting. We've seen some shifts in terms of what's happening in the workplace. And so we've seen increases in the types of experiences of exclusion in certain categories and decreases in others. But as an example, recognition is one of our categories of inclusion. And so bear with me, I'm just going to actually read this. So if you see my eyes shift, it's because I'm making sure I give you the right stats. But so for recognition, 32% of all of the folks that we've engaged with have shared at least one experience of exclusion that had to do with recognition. And that summed up to being 20% of all experiences of exclusion that we've ever captured. So 20%, like that is massive when we're thinking of like 9 categories. 20% of all experiences of exclusion had to do with recognition. And that's because in part, these are assumptions. I'm not going to say that I know that all 20% are linked this way, but we're all moving to hybrid working models and remote working, and folks no longer have that like easy pass you in the hallway, hey, good work situation to help reiterate their appreciation for one another. You're no longer meeting face to face to be able to get that sense of value in just folks' quick conversations, right? And so we have to intentionally create space to recognize people and their work and to ensure that they understand that we value them. So the types of experiences of exclusion that we're seeing here are things like people having their ideas ignored, or folks taking credit for your ideas, or introverted and quiet people feeling as if they are not getting recognized or called upon for their opinion as often, right? And so just some ideas around what we're seeing around recognition. Similarly, we're seeing work-life balance, which is another category of inclusion, is becoming more complicated in the last year and a half. And so 25% of all folks that shared an experience of exclusion with us shared at least one experience that had to do with work-life balance. And it ends up being about 12% of all experiences that we have collected have to do with work-life balance. And so this is things like, and so again, just types of exclusion that we're seeing, not having one's needs taken into account when scheduling meetings, or like salaried employees saying, hey, I'm, for whatever reason, I'm expected to be like on call and available 24/7, and that's just unacceptable and not reasonable. And not having like flex options and those types of opportunities available equitably across the entire organization. We're seeing a lot of like certain roles or certain levels of organizations have a little bit more flexibility than others, and that's something we really need to look at. Okay, I could give you more. Do you want some more?
How are y'all feeling, folks? I'm like taking notes and like, so like framework, tell me all the things.
Yeah,
Yeah, maybe two more. So we have work life balance,
sure.
and maybe two more, and then we'll move on to the next question.
That works for me. Okay, so I think one of the next biggest like areas that we try to get folks to pay attention to is learning and growth. And so learning and growth to us is, opportunities to, grow within the organization so that you're not having to hop like company to company to move up, right? And we're seeing that 23% of all employees in organizations that we've worked with have had at least one learning and growth experience that they share with us relating to exclusion. It ends up being about 12% of all of our experiences of exclusion. And so to give you a sense, often what we're seeing in the learning and growth category is just simply folks not feeling like they have equitable access to professional development, coaching opportunities, mentorship, attending conferences, these types of opportunities that really allow you to further your education, your awareness, your expertise in the organization, and so that you do have the ability to work your way up. And so learning and growth is a big one to pay attention to, and to just take a look at your organization to see if things are really being provided equitably. And finally, this one's going to be no shock to anyone, but I feel like, just to acknowledge it is compensation and benefits. It's a category. It's interesting because when we look at compensation and benefits, we have to look at our data a little bit differently, because it may not be that you have compensation and benefits on your mind every single day. When it comes to like respect and recognition, those are the kind of things that like grind on you. You're like thinking about them every single day, and you're like, these people are really just on my nerves or whatever, right? But when it comes to compensation and benefits, you may only be thinking about it once a year during your promotion period, or like, oh, you see somebody else gets a raise, or gets offered a position that you didn't, whatever it might be. Those are those moments where you're kind of paying attention. Those are promotion opportunities. Those are slightly different, but compensation related promotions, certainly. So they just don't happen as frequently. So the statistics get a little skewed, because when you talk about like the percentage of experiences, it's not as many experiences. It's about 15% of all experiences of exclusion. So it's not low, but it's not as significant as folks think. But it ends up being a lot of people, right? So about 30% of all folks that we have collected experiences of exclusion have mentioned something relating to compensation and benefits. And oftentimes it's a lack of clarity around how is pay determined. Like, is there transparency? Like, really, that is a big thing. It's like offering clarity around like, how do I get a little bit, more pay? How do I work my way up in this way? Is a pay increase even possible? Are the folks around me making a lot more money than me? I have no idea, right? That lack of transparency and process and just, access is really important. But also thinking about it in perspective of benefits, because pay isn't the only factor here. We often see that there's inequitable access to benefits across organizations. And so folks at the top, not only get paid the most, but also have access to additional benefits. And so really taking a look at benefits as a piece of your compensation, and seeing if it's also being provided in an equitable way across the entire organization. So that would just be another one that I would add. And, if you're interested in learning about all 9 categories and all these types of stats, Arshia, who I mentioned earlier, also publishes our newsletter every week. She is currently publishing a blog post series that is analyzing all of our data in this way and looking at every single category. And I think like 7 of the 9, or we have blog posts out so far, but definitely you can take a look at those. And she does a deep dive into what we're seeing in each category.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, Lisa. Such
Yeah.
rich insight. And I see you all asking questions in the chat. I'm trying my best to copy and paste them in the Q&A so they won't get lost in the chat. So feel free to move to the Q&A just to make sure your question is there. And if it's not, please put your questions there so we can bombard Lisa with all of our questions, right? But thank you so much for sharing that because we often give our clients a survey a lot of times if they're not sure where they are or if there's some distrust or harm has been done prior to us facilitating our workshops. And so we have our equity tool analysis and or we do a full assessment where we're trying to understand like where are they as a company, what are some of the strengths that they have because that's important to highlight, but then also where are the opportunities for growth. And three of what you mentioned, work life balance, professional development, compensation and benefits come up a lot, but when we double click on that data, we recognize that there is a difference for people with marginalized identities. So we often see women, people of color, people within the LGBTQIA community, people with disabilities, and so forth, finding themselves not having as much clarity or feeling like they don't feel included. Maybe take a couple seconds or a minute to say anything about that. I'm curious if your data looks at demographics to really show some of these areas of exclusion.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of reasons we, partner and, and why we're so aligned. Yes, absolutely. And so a couple of looks, these are, I wish I could, paint the charts for you all, but just visualize with me. And if you'd like to see an example later, certainly reach out. But the way that we look at the data, at a high level is first and foremost, as I mentioned, we're kind of taking a look at like, what are we seeing? Where are we seeing the most frequent experiences of exclusion as it relates to categories, but also as it relates to source, meaning those, is it my business, like leadership team policy, um, you know, direct managers, peers, customers, whomever it might be, or whatever it might be that's causing it. And that really gives us a heat map of like the types of experiences throughout the organization. But that is clearly not enough to understand, what actually needs to happen to drive the right initiatives and change internally within the organization. So, really, the next level is very much in line with what you were just describing. We take a look to see if there's any differences or what are the differences in experiences as it relates to identity. And so, as an example, we may take a look and say, okay, as it relates to compensation and benefits. So, again, contextualizing in the categories for clarity for our purpose. But within that category, if folks say that they have an invisible or visible disability, does that mean that they have more experiences of exclusion, less, or about the same? And so we start to rate the experiences of exclusion in each category based on identity metrics as well to see if there's a gap in experience. And wherever we see those large gaps is where we're going to make recommendations. So it's not always just around, hey, we really see that like folks really need to be we need to work on recognition because that's where the most experiences of exclusion are across your organization. Like, great, that's one recommendation. But also, we noticed that, as an example, in a law firm that we recently worked with, um, we found exactly that. We found that folks with that had an invisible or invisible disability, so folks that just identified with having a disability, had much less had how to contextualize this, had many more experiences of exclusion as it related to work-life balance than other groups, than folks who did not identify as having a disability. So in this organization, that these are law firms. They're like, of course we have a work-life balance issue. Like they're going to brush that off really quickly. But we're like, hold on. Yes, you have a work-life balance issue. You knew that. But more importantly, folks with a disability have even more experiences of exclusion as it relates to work-life balance. So can we at least bring them up to par with everyone else and make sure that they aren't having additional or experiences beyond everyone else as it relates to exclusion? And so we are definitely looking at that gap as well. It's tricky to explain that in the data sometimes, and to like map it out visually. So that's something we're certainly working on simplifying, but it is how we prioritize our recommendations internally.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And I think it's important to highlight that in the data, especially with companies who sometimes need the numbers or need to understand that research. But I also think there's something powerful about not to say that worship of the written word, as we often talk about white supremacy culture, is the only way. And I think having both quantitative and qualitative information really does create a strong pamphlet, if you would say, to say, hey, this isn't working, right? This isn't working for your company, it's not specifically working for these folks. Like, what's happening there? Because we don't always face our biases, or we might say, hey, we're doing great, we're an inclusive company. But when we look at the data, that doesn't necessarily align for everyone, specifically those with marginalized identities. So thanks so much for highlighting that. So, folks, we're going to take about 5 more minutes as we have this chat. Again, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A panel or the section, and then we'll turn over after 5 minutes. All right. So we talked a bit about some of the trends, right? We talked a bit about what's working and what's not working. Now I want to shift gears to think more about, how do we successfully bake DEI into everything we do as companies or organizations? I know when we were finding you on the stage, somebody put in the chat, like, hey, we're trying to figure out how do we even start or do DEI work at a small company. And some of y'all might be consultants, some of you might work at a small company, a large company. So, whatever tips might help. I know that each company might need different things, but in a general sense, from your experience and your research and what you've seen, how can people successfully bake DEI into everything they do as a company?
Yeah, it's a complex question, but we're here for it. Um, my first tip, particularly as it relates to those small organizations that you're referencing, is to not wait until you're big, or wait until you are large enough to hire an HR person. It's one of the biggest things that we see, particularly in early stage like tech startups, or in small consulting firms, is that they overlook the responsibility of setting those mission and values and like norms within their organization from day one. Whether or not you're doing this work, you are setting expectations and behaviors around it. And so, I would just urge you all to not wait just because you're too small, and to start to like put the foundations of where you see this work, how you see it playing out in your organization, and prioritizing that, particularly as it relates to like recruiting and how you engage with the current employees. Now, beyond that, it's really, really important to seamlessly integrate DEI work like into the day-to-day work of our teams. And so what I mean by that is that we absolutely have to remove it as an HR function. That is not the way that we see this work. It is the way that it exists currently, but hopefully, yes, we're kind of pulling it further and further out of that bucket. It should be a strategic lens in which you're viewing all initiatives, all work. It should be, mentioned in every meeting, and every decision should be thought through from that perspective. And it needs to be built into performance reviews and bonuses and promotion, considerations. And there needs to be systems of accountability. And the only way to do that is to make sure that your company is living and breathing and practicing this work on a day-to-day basis. And so, it's not easy, but the more you do it, the more comfortable it becomes. And so, whether that's creating a format of meetings so that you're making sure that like in every meeting we hit these certain things or certain topics or lenses that we need to like ask around whatever decisions we're making, right? Whatever that might be, just making sure that it differs like on a day-to-day basis depending on what your role is or your function. But particularly when decisions are getting made, when folks are getting invited to things, when we're looking at, who's getting invited to work on various projects, things like this, like, my goodness, those simple decisions on a day-to-day basis make such a difference in the outcome of the sense of inclusion and just the overall success of an organization. So thinking through it that way and making sure that everyone understands where the organization's headed, but also understands that they're a big part of that. One of the big things that we talk about in our work is that, yes, we're coming at this work in a lot of different ways. We're looking at it from, the systemic changes that need to occur, the government policy changes that need to occur, the corporate behaviors that, need to change, but also there are individual day-to-day things that are influencing folks' sense of inclusion. And so when we look at all of our data as an example, and just kind of like another little tidbit to take away from our research, what we found is that it's people, not policy. Very rarely are folks pointing to policy as the source of exclusion in the moments that are making them feel excluded. It is people, time and time again. And so when you think about that, it's like, right, so it's the individual interactions you're having with the folks around you that are making you feel included or excluded. Even more, it's most often direct managers and leadership teams. And so there's this shift where it's like leaders have to take ownership of that account, that responsibility is like, not only are we saying as business leaders, yes, this is now a priority for our organization. Yes, I will write the check to do that work. Many business leaders stop there. What we're having to do when we come into these organizations is say, hold on, hold on, hold on. You're actually a big part of the problem. Like, let us show you. And we need you to be open-minded to hearing that feedback. And so we're preparing them to be basically told that they are part of the problem and they have to shift their behaviors as well. And so, yeah, in terms of baking it in, I think that it's, starts from the top. Leadership teams have to model inclusive behaviors, inclusive language. They have to set healthy boundaries. And when they fail to do that, they need to be humble and be allowed to be held accountable and create the space for that. But then you also just have to, from a structural perspective, dig it out of HR and make sure that we're thinking of it more as a lens and a company-wide initiative.
Lisa, yes, 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 yes. I'm literally sitting here being like, okay, relax, because this is recorded, and so if this is shared and you're doing all these movements, folks gonna be like, what's going on, Fatima? But yes, right, like even what you said around like starting from the beginning, I think that's what makes it harder because a lot of companies or workplaces they weren't designed to center diversity, equity, inclusion. Most of us weren't even supposed to be in the workplace or be leaders, right? And so we are literally trying to flip the script in a company and organization that has been catered towards certain identities. And what you're telling us is so important because it's not just about, what's not working, but you're also telling us what's working. And it's like, okay, we either do what's working or some of our companies and organizations won't last, right? Because day and night, every time we look at a new research survey that comes out from like 2 years ago to now, everyone is like, if the company isn't inclusive, I'm leaving, right? And so that inclusion piece is key. My last question for you, feel free to answer it in a minute or less before we move on.
Hint, hint.
Right, before we move on to Q&A. No, I love all your answers. I just want to make sure we get to the
You got it.
the audience so they won't fight me after this. But I'm gonna switch up the last question a bit because I think you've already done an amazing job answering some of the questions I was going to ask. So hopefully this isn't a scary surprise. But our main topic today is focus areas for 2022. And I know a lot of folks are like, okay, so what do I need to be paying attention to come December 31st? Or maybe I need to start planning now so I'm already ready for January 1st. But if you had your top three things that companies should really focus on or think about for 2022, what would those things be?
Yeah. Um, I think that you need to create, first step is to create a sense of the goals that you're going to have for the next year and get buy-in for that. That's the very first thing you should do. You should be having those conversations now about what you want to accomplish in 2022. And if you can't get buy-in from everyone, maybe it's just like you and your team are doing this. And like, that's fine. You can do it in your bubble to start. Just know that that is an okay way to start this work is you don't have to have everyone on board. You can do the work internally to a team or a department. We often collaborate in that way with organizations, but whatever size or sliver of an organization you're working with, decide what you're going to work on, what you want to accomplish and why. That's the first thing. The second thing is determining how you're going to measure success and how you're going to report that out. So just say like, hey, these were our goals. Here's how we're going to know that we were successful. And here's how frequently we're going to take a look at this. And, here's what we think we're going to do as a step one to see if that does or doesn't work. Now, the other thing, and I mentioned this previously, is like you have to get feedback from the folks that are going to be impacted. And so whether that's an employee survey or doing an assessment like we do or whatever it might be, we need to find a way to get the employee's voice on their experiences, their interests, their needs, the better like ways to support them. And let me just provide a word of caution. I did not follow the directions about a minute. Word of caution here. We often find that a lot of surveys are like, on a scale of 1 to 5, do you feel X? And the problem with that is it doesn't tell you what needs to happen. Like people, just the way that our minds work is like you're going to be like terrified to hit 5, terrified to hit 1. So we're really looking at on 5 points scale. Most people are going to, unless they're really, really happy or really, really upset, they're probably going to pick 2, 3, or 4. And whether you're an average of a 2.3 or a 3.3, that tells you nothing. Literally nothing. So, you can compare those metrics year over year, but like you don't know what to focus on or what to shift from that. And so when we say employee voice, you have to go beyond those types of metric surveys. They're just not serving you well. And so just I'll throw that out there. I'll let you, look at your own surveys and see what's problematic, but certainly happy to chat about that further. But just employee voice and aligned goals is what I would urge you to start with.
Thank you, Lisa. You are amazing.
Thank
Yes,
you.
magic. The first question here is, how do we make space for the individual values? Oh, that just went down. Someone just voted another question. Okay, I'll read that because it won't be
It's all
fair.
good.
So, how do we make space for the individual values of a company when we talk about diversity? How do we handle the limitations of personal values? And I'm going to go ahead and show it on the stage in case people need that question. But any thoughts or answers to this question, Lisa?
I have so many questions about this question, but I'm I'm. Let me know if you think this is different, Fatima. In terms of
Mhm.
framing, are they looking? Do you think that we're looking at where personal values are not aligned with company values, or personal values conflict with company values? Is that what we're looking at
That's
here?
how I understood the question. And if the person wants to put in chat that we're interpreting
Yeah.
correctly, please let us know. But yeah, that's exactly how I'm understanding that
I
question.
think increasingly, and you kind of hinted to this earlier, but increasingly, potential employees, candidates are coming into interviews to specifically say, like, what are your company values? How are you making a difference? How do you make decisions internally? And I think that increasingly that's going to help us get away from this problem, hopefully. But did you get clarity? I just saw your.
Yeah, you saw my thinking face.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a hand up. So we'll quickly, I think Teresa wants to clarify. So if you can, just in a few seconds, that'll be awesome.
Uh, okay, can y'all hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
we
Hi,
can hear
Teresa.
you.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so what comes to mind is like Chick-fil-A, Hobby Lobby, like like religion, like how the religion of that company is in their framework, but the values of that company by nature and because of their religion and because of what they value, by nature it excludes certain people. That's what I was talking about. I was saying, like, how do you navigate that and how do you make space for that? Because to me, what I'm starting to understand diversity to be is that it's making space for a person's individual experience, but in the same way, like, there's also limitations because your personal experience could be harmful to me. So I guess the question is, how do you navigate that? um am I asking the
It's
right
a
question?
great question. No,
Yes,
Teresa,
we
I've
got
got
you,
you.
Teresa. We got
It's
you.
great.
Okay,
Awesome.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so
so much,
much for the
Teresa.
clarity.
no problem.
Yeah. Okay, so a lot of thoughts come to mind. I will start by saying that a lot of times organizations and the values that are developed by people in power, meaning they're developed by a bunch of white folks, they're developed by people who have privilege, they're developed by folks that are in a normative majority group and have that comfort and cushion, right? And so um, the reality is the outcome means that they have this ability to justify those types of decisions by surrounding themselves by folks that agree, right? In the way that we approach this work, we are not saying does this behavior align with the company values. Instead, we're saying what is making people feel excluded, and no one is more important than the other person. And we aren't always bringing to the surface, things that are most prevalent. We're sometimes bringing the things that are more importantly impacting those who are more often impacted by experiences of exclusion, right? And so we as an organization have the responsibility to surface the right opportunities for change that needs to occur. And so we kind of carry that weight heavily. And, it's something that we think about a lot in terms of like how we navigate what we share with organizations, because, it's very easy sometimes to fall into the trap of validating the things that they need to continue to exist with the behaviors that are in place. Right. And so that's a long-winded answer, but I do think that the end result ends up being that individuals whose values don't align with an organization's are not going to be able to do their best work. They're not going to be happy. They're not going to support. They're not going to be the most creative, the most collaborative, all the things that you look for. They're just not going to be able to do that. And so, my hope is that more and more individuals find that alignment with their employers. It's a big, ask and certainly a privilege. But I'm hoping that we shift more that direction.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lisa. And another thing I'll add to that is also what's our responsibility as consumers, right? And so I love that Teresa gave an example of Chick-fil-A and whatnot. And part of the question is, how do we offset that balance? Because oftentimes companies don't feel like they need to do better, or leaders don't feel like they need to do better if their company is successful enough, right? So everything that Lisa said, like, yeah, people won't be as creative or as innovative as the next company, and people are also sometimes okay with just where they're at, right? And so I think the follow-up question is, like, what are we also doing on an individual level to either support or not support folks who don't align with our values, that will make them question, how do I show up differently if I choose to do so at all?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and just a small, like, interesting tidbit is, like, our organization and many organizations that we know of that are kind of in this space are now forming organizations as public benefit corporations. So it's not, we're not a nonprofit. We're certainly out here to make money, but the idea is that we want to be very clear that we are prioritizing impact and meaningful impact. And that gets prioritized over profit, meaning we want to make sure we're existing in the world as a mission-driven company. And I think that many organizations have to answer that question, like, who are you accountable for? How are you defining success as a company? And hopefully more and more companies start stepping into that mission-driven space.
Yeah, for sure. I'm always like, why? How? This does not align. Your mission is this, but your actions don't align. So let's figure
Exactly.
that out. Thank you so much for that question. So in our next question is, what is your intake process when working with a new company? Do you start with representation metrics, then move on to surveys and interviews? How long does this all take?
Oh, I love this question. Thank you. Like, sure, I'll talk about what we do. Certainly. Thank you, Roxanne. It's a little bit different than that. We are a tech company. However, we are human centric in our approach, meaning that when we do inclusion assessments initially, the way that we're onboarding folks into our technology is through workshops. And so we'll host, typically for an organization, let's say there's an organization with a couple thousand folks, we might have like 4 different onboarding workshops. That way, again, inclusion, we want to make sure everyone has access. And during that workshop, we're giving folks the language and awareness around why inclusion is important, how the decisions unfold at a company level, how they unfold at the individual level. We give them context of our framework. We build up that trust and really give them a sense of, like, how we're going to use this data, how we commit to not using this data. And really, it's just our way, our opportunity to engage with them, to say, we're here for you. And we want to hear your voice in this process. And so throughout that workshop, they can ask questions, but then the important piece is that we guide them through an exercise where they interact with our technology. And really, it's 3 key things. The first one is essentially a Mad Lib format story that they tell about themselves. We don't ask them for their name or their email address, but we ask them to share information like their gender identity, sexual orientation, the race, ethnicity, whether they identify as having a disability, their age bracket, different information. Worth noting, it's always optional. They can always self-describe if they don't feel limited by the dropdown. They don't have to provide us any of that information, but it provides additional context for the next step, which is where we get those experiences of exclusion that we described earlier, where it's literally a brainstorming session where they just type and describe moments that have made them feel excluded. And then we ask them a couple questions like, hey, which category does this relate to? And like, who or what was causing you to feel excluded in this moment? How frequently does this happen? We get that data, and then we analyze it, as I was describing earlier. That allows us to uncover the biggest opportunities in each organization so that they aren't looking for silver bullet solutions, but rather are understanding the day-to-day experience of their employees and where they can actually start. So we don't really do representation metrics for every single person in the organization. It's like, who shows up, who wants to provide it, great. And also, what are the experiences of exclusion? And that is the most important piece, is really understanding those behaviors and moments that are causing folks to feel excluded. I hope that
Awesome.
helps.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that process because I don't think I knew every single step. So, shouts to Roxanne for this question. I'm going to go ahead and mark his answer so we can probably have time for two more questions. Is that fine with you, Lisa?
Works for me. Yeah, great.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. So, what are some trends for DEI advocacy in 2022?
Advocacy, meaning, um, how are we moving the needle in this work, and what are we like? What are the topics? I guess
Yeah.
that's kind of a generic question as well. But Melissa, if you have any clarity, certainly let me know. But in terms of trends for 2020, I think we're going to see a lot more, as mentioned earlier, folks adopting actual departments or teams, like hiring folks to do this work outside of HR. We're seeing that increasingly. So we'll continue to see those hiring and actual budgets go towards the work, but also increased accountability, meaning stakeholders, meaning stockholders, investors, consumers are holding companies more and more accountable. And so they're having to be more transparent. And so we're seeing an increase of companies be really public about, here's where we land in terms of representation metrics. Here's where we land in terms of our goals for the year. Here's where we can make some improvements. Now, most of those we see are really surface level and basic and could, they could do a lot more, but it's a step in the right direction in terms of transparency. And so we're seeing an increase of that. But we're also seeing an increase in leveraging actual data and metrics, which is a big step. It's confusing because everyone's telling you to track different metrics, but the reality is that data is good. Any sort of measurement is a step in the right direction and allows us to understand how we're making progress, even if it's not the metrics that I would like to see everywhere. It's a step in the right direction. So I think that's a big one across most organizations as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. And on our end, as a company that facilitates workshops, we've been seeing a lot of our clients trying to find folks who are doing the DEI work internally, right? So you have a lot of companies who are like, "Hey, we don't know how to do this work. Let's find someone external." But if we remember Lisa's 3 points of what's working, one of them was not just finding what works for people, but then also being really clear about focus areas. And people are realizing that in order for them to do really great work, they need someone internally to do that work, right? Like I can only do but so much as a consultant or as a coach or as a trainer, but you also have to be really clear about your goals. And so that trend is happening. I just say if we're hiring folks, amazing, but please give them a good budget so they have something to work with and
Yeah.
a team because DI work is not easy. It ain't for the weak, as they often say, right? And so don't hire someone expecting them to change your whole company or organization without supporting them with the tools that they need. So I also wanted to add that.
I just saw a tweet today, and I wish I knew who tweeted it. I'll go find it and retweet it so that everyone can find it. But essentially, it was saying that the best way, because there's a shortage of folks doing this work that are available and that have the experience, and they were saying the best way to recruit folks into this role is tell them they can take the first 2 months off because they're all tired and worn down and burnt out, and they just need a minute before they can come back in and really be able to commit the space and the energy that it takes to be successful in this work. And I was like, that is real.
So
So
real,
good.
so real. And that's
Yeah.
like the trend for every other job. Like people are like, hey, I'm worth more than just getting work done. Like I'm more than my productivity. And like that trend is all over. We talk about the great resignation. Like people leaving jobs during a pandemic says a lot, right?
It says
About
a lot.
how
Yeah,
we're valuing ourselves, our time, and our ability to do our magical superpowers and what
definitely.
we have expertise in. So thank you. Thank you. All right, so this is our last question for tonight. Forgive us if we weren't able to get to it, but to your question. But our last question, Lisa, is what are some examples for bringing DEI into the everyday meetings at all functions to encourage more and more people to be active and thoughtful about this?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sarah. Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. So one of our I would say clients from early last year. It was like an insight that like we found, and we've literally like been glued to it ever since. And it was a financial services company, but we realized that it was like over 20% of the experiences of exclusion in this one organization had the word meeting in it. And so we often use that as a very relevant and familiar example for everyone, because we're like, no, this is prevalent. Everyone gets it. Everyone has had an experience in a meeting that has caused them to feel excluded. Based on the experiences that we're seeing, the ways that you can create more inclusive meeting practices start from just considering folks' agenda and personal needs when you're scheduling a meeting, particularly now that we're increasingly global and remote. Folks are sometimes inconsiderate around time zones, or just the fact that like, hey, I'd like to drop my kids off at school before I like have to get on a Zoom call. Can you give me a 30-minute buffer to do that? Or just really allowing that flexibility and consideration to occur when we're scheduling meetings is really important. Considering religious holidays and things like this really can go a long way. Beyond that initial scheduling, thinking through like who is in a meeting, who is given the power to be heard in those meetings, like who is getting to show up. Because what we find is repeatedly folks that are key contacts on an account, or have expertise in the topic of the meeting, aren't getting invited to those meetings. And so they feel like they're undervalued, underrecognized, aren't able to contribute at the level that they would like to. And so, being really thoughtful in terms of, nobody wants their schedule stacked with meetings, but at the same time, they want to feel like they have the ability to show up and add value where they can. And so even if it's just saying, hey, no pressure if you're not available, but would love to hear your opinion in this meeting if you have time, like that goes a long way. And so just letting people know that you would like to hear their opinion, you want their insight, you want them to show up, and having that modeled throughout the way that the meeting goes down. The other thing is, agendas in advance of meetings, so folks can prepare if they're someone who's not always comfortable, speaking up. Being able to prepare for what they think, or seeing the documents in advance, goes a long way for making sure that the same voices aren't heard every single time. I'm pretty good at like spitting random answers off in the moment, but the reality is I will have a very different answer if you give me an hour to think about it. And so just creating that value in that meeting by sending the agenda in advance goes a long way as well. And finally, and again, I feel like these are all common sense, but we have to think about them. But finally, it's just like in the actual engagement, making sure that you're saying, hey, what about you? What's your thought? I think that you might have something valuable to add here, or like, hey, I know your expertise is X, like, what do you think here? Or, hey, so-and-so was talking, let's let her finish. Just making sure that everyone has the chance to be heard and contribute is really, really powerful. And then wrapping up a meeting so that in a way that shows that you're thankful for everyone's contributions, and that you valued their time is going to go a long way as well. So those are like really, it's funny because like sometimes being inclusive is just the simple things, but by being thoughtful and making sure that we're building those into our practices and making sure that that's how things go down every single time, it's incredibly impactful. It moves the needle.
Love all of these tips. Like, yes. Okay, Lisa, you can come co-facilitate a workshop with us, because that's often what we add to our tips, and plus one to everything that I'm seeing in the chat. I think another thing that we notice as well, or a lot of people come to us and they say, hey, I work on a team that's mostly men, and as a woman, I'm always interrupted, and or when I give a suggestion, it's not heard or people don't acknowledge it. But when my colleague, who's a man, gives that same suggestion or similar to suggestion, they're acknowledged, right? Or we talk a lot about office housework versus glamour work, right? So like when a meeting starts, who's asked to take notes? And is it consistently women of color, women,
Yes.
or are we like, do we have a ritual where it's like we're taking turns while we're taking notes? Like that always comes up, and we literally have to do scenarios with our clients to talk about, well, everything that you just said, and then also maybe taking turns leading a meeting to disrupt that hierarchy that oftentimes happens. Like, who wants to sit in a virtual meeting and like one person is just talking at you, right? And so
Yeah.
getting people more engaged is spot on. So I wanted to add those two things that we always see in our workshops.
Same. Yeah, those are great. It's
Awesome.
incredible. It's if you send an agenda out in advance, like the reality is you shouldn't have to like run a meeting. It should be a conversation as long as everyone knows what the goal of the meeting is. And so I think it goes a long
Agreed.
way.
Yeah, agreed. All right, so full transparency, y'all. I know the agenda says we'll be answering questions till 6:45, but because we started early, I said we were on our last question. So those of y'all who were like, answer my question, Fatima. Lisa, how are you feeling? Do you have time to answer the last two questions, or would you
Sure,
like?
let's go.
Okay,
Yeah,
all
we
right,
got time.
we got time. Okay, awesome. So let me. So, a question specifically, obviously for you. Are there any data points or findings specific to municipality orgs versus private or nonprofit? Let me show the question on the stage.
Um, yes. I would be doing you a disservice if I tried to just pull those out of my brain. Just to be honest, that being said, I'm happy to do that. And so, specifically, what one thing that comes to mind is that we worked with two organizations that really gave us insight into what's happening in communities differently than workplaces. And so one of those was through an organization called Traverse Connects, which is an organization that is trying to fuel small businesses in a 5 county region in northern Michigan. And so we really got to see the lens of which they were thinking about driving increased diversity and inclusion, but in a community through small businesses. And so that was really interesting. I have a lot of interesting data points from that. I won't, again, try to rattle them off from the top of my head, but I'm happy to share some of it. And we'll be revisiting them in March to see how far they've come, which will be super interesting. The other organization that we were able to look at that was interesting like that was a regulatory body that is regulating financial services organizations. And so yeah, if either of those feels aligned or interesting, certainly reach out and I'm happy to share. But I think one thing I'll say is that respect ends up being really, really high. And that's not uncommon across most organizations, but increasingly so in those settings.
Awesome, perfect. I already like the connection that's possible for people if you have more questions for Lisa. So thanks for answering that question. All right, our final and last question is: does the framework or tool that you mentioned help to track instances of microaggressions?
Yeah, it does. In that most microaggressions are moments that cause folks to feel excluded. I think, experiences of exclusion is just our language to kind of be a broader bucket. And so we're often having to contextualize and define that when we're in that onboarding experience with folks. But we are often looking through all of the experiences of exclusion to understand where are the microaggressions, and we're flagging those in our initial report on where they should focus. Because the types of initiatives and shifts that need to occur are different when we're seeing microaggressions stack in a category. And so, yeah, the answer is yes. And, we do our best to, through narratives in our workshop, kind of pull those out and give folks examples of what we're looking for. And our hope is that we are actively, targeting and addressing those.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your wealth of knowledge, wisdom, practice. I feel like we had to have a dramatic silence of just like
It's
how
wonderful.
awesome, right? Like I see people in the chat appreciating all that you shared today. If folks want to react by just giving Lisa some love with our virtual applause for your time here with us and really just taking a moment to help us understand not just what inclusion looks like in data, but like some practical examples of what we can be doing in our day to day and things that we can be looking to and thinking about in 2022. So
All
as
these like
we
hearts and claps floating up
I know,
feels so good. I'm like, this
right?
platform was designed so well. Oh my gosh, it feels amazing. Thank you so much.
It really was. It really was. I mean, we're trying to recreate the like in-person feel, and I think we got to work with what we
I
have. So
like it.
I'm glad that's doing that for you. If folks, want to stay on longer, once we end the session, you can go back to the tables and chat with one another. What I'm going to do is share where you can stay in touch with SGO. So one of the things we often say is like, in order for you to know what we're doing or when we're holding our virtual events, is to sign up for our newsletter. So like after you sign up for Hilarious, because listen, it is amazing. Feel free to go and stay in touch with us. We have two newsletters. So one is for our community, where we really help women and allies and non-binary folk have some empowering events, and then we have our corporate work, which is what we're doing here, our formal and informal events. So subscribe to both if you like, but up to you. And then Lisa just shared her contact info, where to find her. So her email is there. And then also, if you want to connect with Lisa via LinkedIn, that's also there for you. We'll be sure to send all of this via email. So if you're like, where's the framework? Don't worry, we'll send the recording, the email, and all of that. All right, Lisa, final thoughts, feels before we let folks go?
Thank you so much for the time, everyone, for the conversation and the incredible questions. Fatima, thank you so much for being such an incredible facilitator. You all, if you're interested in that newsletter or an ebook about our framework or any other resources that can be helpful to you if you're trying to start these conversations internal to your organization, just know that I do have resources for you for free. So just reach out, let me know. I'm happy to help, and also happy to share more about our work if that's of interest. So I hope to stay in touch.
Awesome. I'm so excited I know you. And congratulations again to you and Ilaria for the great work that you're
Thank you.
doing. And folks, I'll be on for a little while, so feel free to engage if you have time at the end of this. All right. Good night.
Bye, all.